everybody, and welcome to a very special edition of Gospel of Galactus. Today, we are going to be talking about what's at the heart of this channel, and that is comics, theology, mythology, and how these things are actually seen and interpreted by academia and scholarship. And in order to do that, I am extremely grateful to Dr. Greg Stevenson of Rochester University, who's come on to discuss not only his work in this very field, but also a book he's written entitled Theology and the Marvel Universe. Dr. Stevenson, I'm going to kick it over to you to kind of explain what the impetus for this book was, what it's about, and what got you started. And we'll just kind of go from there in the discussion.
Well, yeah, first off, thanks for having me. Happy to be here and discuss these issues and things. Yeah, I mean, I've always had a long time interest in comic books, superhero stories, and so forth. And being a theologian, the intersection between those two has always been of some interest to me. I didn't really set out specifically. It wasn't really my intention necessarily initially to do this book. I had done some journal articles and chapters and other books on theology and comic books and so forth at different times, but it really kind of came out of the blue, where I was contacted by a man named Matthew Brake, who has a website on pop culture theology, and it's a very good website to go to, where he has academics and different people writing articles and things on different aspects of sort of pop culture and theology. And he's also the editor for the pop culture and theology series that Lexington Books and Fortress Academic does. And so he just contacted me out of the blue. I guess he had come across some of my other writings that I've done on pop culture, and basically just asked me, if I was interested in editing a book in their series. And he said the topic was pretty much up to me, whatever I wanted to do. And immediately, theology and Marvel came to mind. That's something I've always been interested in. And kind of what I wanted to do that was a little different than what's typically been done up to this point in the series, because most of the sort of books and academic work that's been done on theology and Marvel has heavily focused on the comics. And so I wanted to broaden that and look at not only Marvel comics, but Marvel films, Marvel television, and kind of combine all of that together and look at some of the interactions between that.
When you first started contemplating this, maybe even first writing about this stuff, when do you think for you was that first connection you made between, there's a lot of what maybe I believe personally, or there's at least, maybe even if it's not what I believe personally, there's a lot of very similar religious theology, these notions. I equate back when I was religious and I was going to church and I was in 7th grade junior high group. This is how I got into Star Wars, right? I wonder how many pastors have inadvertently turned kids onto Star Wars because of them, because there's so many just direct ties between these things. And if you can do it with Star Wars, you can certainly do it with Marvel. What was sort of the seed that planted in your brain for this? Was it an interview where you heard somebody reference it? Was it your own sort of just, academic sense picking this thing up? What got you just turned on to the subject in the first place?
Well, it was actually, I've always been, from as long as I can remember, I've always been interested in pop culture, superhero stories, just kind of, sci-fi, fantasy. That whole sort of genre has always been an interest of mine. And then, of course, my academic interests have always been kind of in biblical studies, theology. And for the longest time, I never really thought of bringing those two together at all. They just kind of existed separately. And it really kind of, I think, really where it came to is several years ago, I wrote a book on Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was
Okay.
the first thing I've really sort of done in pop culture. And that really just grew out of, I was a big fan of the show. And I remember just hanging around in the hallways of our
I
offices.
knew I'd heard of your name before I did this. I knew I'd heard
Okay.
you tie to something. And I have huge Buffy fans. And as soon as you said that, just it hit right in my head. Okay.
Yeah, but there were several other professors at our university that were also big fans of the show, and so sitting in the cafeteria or in the hallway, we would just kind of hang out and have these conversations, and I'd be
Nerd
hearing them
discussions
talking.
become nerd papers, don't they?
Oh yeah, and they'd be talking about it from their academic perspective, and that just got me thinking about the possibilities of combining these two, and so that's where the idea for that book sort of started and eventually grew. And my intention was for that just to be a one-off. And then I'd go back to kind of my main academic interest. But after that book came out, I started getting a lot of just offers to write this or write that or do different things in religion and popular culture. And so it just kind of took on a life of its own. And so that then I started doing, writing various chapters for books on theology and comic books and so forth, as well as other topics. But yeah, that's kind of where it started, and then just took on a life of its own.
I remember I was sitting there I mean, we had talked about a lot of things leading up to Infinity War, but I remember post Infinity War is sort of like when I think I'd had the most nerdiest discussion ever. And I'll allude to it now because we can get to it in the discussion of Paul and Kenosis. But it was sort of like this idea that Kristen brought up in your first article about Paul and Kenosis, which we'll reference here in just a minute because the audience has no idea what we're talking about yet. Well, maybe some do. But I remember just reading in here about people who are Thanos can go and do this and it'll solve the problem. And then, of course, Kristen is very quick to mention this article. The very first thing that I found out when I went and talked to a life sciences professor, like, no, he'd have to repeat this call pretty efficiently because the human population would just rebound like way too quickly. And
Right.
I remember that was like the first like super nerd discussion I got into where I was like getting into the weeds of how this stuff would work. So let me bring that full circle and we'll jump into that. So with comic books, and movies, and so particularly Marvel right now as they are in the cultural zeitgeist, why is this stuff so important to our understanding of American culture? Are comics just these kid books that are just worthless pictures that we read growing up and hold no value, or are we truly missing on something here?
Well, as far as like American culture, I mean, superhero stories in general are somewhat inherently American. I mean, it's really American culture where the superhero story, as we sort of know it today, the comic book story and all of that really kind of grew and developed. So it's been a part of American culture for a long time. As you mentioned, though, it's a part of American culture that's often been looked down upon as just being children's literature, stories for kids, and so therefore not really taken very seriously.
Great
Kind of
Stan.
like with Disney movies or
Even the great Stan Lieber didn't want his name attached to it. He used to tell the story all the time. He was saving Stan Lieber for the great American novel that he was going to
yeah,
write.
yeah, yeah. So it suffered from that kind of prejudice for a long time, and that's not just comic books. I mean, pop culture as a whole. Television and a lot of these other things that are very much a part of nerd culture have often been kind of looked down upon or seen as not something that's worth taking very seriously. Certainly not from an academic perspective. Why I think it does matter, though, is superhero stories have been around in American culture for nearly 100 years. If you go back to Superman and Batman in the 1930s and so forth, and anything that has that kind of longevity and has been that popular for that long is a fairly significant force in the culture that needs to be taken seriously. And a couple of things that these stories do, a culture sort of shapes its values, creates its values and beliefs through the stories that it tells.
Yeah.
And superhero stories have become one of the most dominant, story types that we're telling in our culture, very prevalent. And so that makes it very worth analyzing and looking at because these stories, they do a couple of things. One, the stories that we tell shape our culture. And superhero stories even do that in some ways. They're a part of shaping the values and the beliefs and the things that we hold dear, and they also reflect our culture back to us. If you look at superhero stories at different times in history, you can see the kinds of values and the stories that they're telling are representative of what's going on in the culture. So they also can provide just a good window into understanding the culture at different periods in time, as in terms of how these stories are being told at different periods in time.
I sort of liken this for somebody who might need an example of this. The best example I like to come to is if you think about radiation and how prevalent radiation was coming out of World War II and in through, the McCarthy era and into the Cold War. Radiation pretty much set the set the ball rolling for superheroes. I mean, even the mug you're drinking out of right now, radioactive spider,
Yep.
radioactive family goes to space. It doesn't really matter. It all comes out of what was the most dominant thing at the time, which was how not just this raw power was going to shape war powers, but also how it was going to shape the very fabric of our lives, the way we receive our energy, what we consider to be worth pursuing in terms of energy technologies and things like that. It all sort of gets this genesis and this proliferation out of Marvel. Like, I'm not saying radiation wouldn't have been insanely popular without Marvel. I just don't know if we would think about it quite the same way. Marvel almost added I don't want to say they taught us not to be afraid of it, but they taught us to admire and wonder these things and respect them for the power that they present by themselves, I
Yeah.
suppose, is how I
Yeah.
always thought it.
Yeah. If you look at the 60s and 70s, and so it is kind of striking just how many superheroes have their origins of their powers and
Yeah.
radiation and so forth.
And that pattern then continues, and we'll get into some of that. But before we do, I kind of want to say, how does this get into the mythology and mythological reinterpretation? You kind of alluded on it in the last response when you said it shapes our lives, and then we pattern these discussions afterwards. Do you want to sort of give an example of mythological reinterpretation or mythic reinvention in comics? You're even free to use the one I sent over, or just one that you like to use with your students that makes the most sense.
Well, I mean, several things here. One, I mean, kind of the connection to mythology is, if you go back to ancient Greece, in Greek mythology, I mean, these were stories about the gods in human form. And one of the primary functions of mythology, and Greek mythology is just one example of this, is that mythology is essentially a collection of stories that we tell to help us understand the world better, to understand ourselves, how to live in the world, how to understand the world around us. And in ancient Greece, they did that through these stories about the gods as a way of thinking about how we connect to the larger universe around us. And comic books are basically playing in the same sandbox essentially. I mean, superhero stories are stories also about essentially gods in human form, sometimes actual gods like Thor, but even just human beings with godlike powers. And so there's a lot of overlap and similarity there as well as in the function of these stories, again trying to help us understand and explain the world around us. And in terms of like mythic reinvention, I mentioned that these stories, one of the things they do is they reflect the society in which they exist. And as our world changes, our stories change with it.
Yeah.
So our stories change to reflect as the world's changing or to shape different things in the world. And so we see that in the comic book stories as well. And this is just a part of mythology. You look at ancient Greek mythology, and their stories are constantly being retold and reinvented. You can take a hero like Zeus and look at him in different periods and the changes that are made in his character and different attributes surrounding him. And so they're constantly reinventing, their own stories as their culture changes. And superhero stories have been doing the same thing for a long time. You can look at like Captain America, who had his origin around the time of World War II. There's this famous comic book of him punching out Hitler on the front cover. Clearly he was representing the values that were going on in society.
Quite literally, right? Captain
Yeah,
America.
exactly. And so one of the things that people who write Captain America have had to do, as our society has changed, is how to get him to fit into a world that's changing in significant ways. What does Captain America look like in a cynical, jaded post 9/11 world? That's something that the first Avengers movie kind of dealt with. Taking this man out of time and how would he fit into this society, and how to figure with that. Yeah, another place I guess you could look at this is because one of my big areas of academic study in the field of biblical studies is the book of Revelation and apocalyptic literature. That's one of my major interests. And I kind of combine that with comic books a little bit. I did a essay for a chapter on uh, comic books and apocalyptic a few years ago. And one of the things I was looking at is it's interesting if you look at the golden age of comic books. Um, there is virtually no reference to the book of Revelation or apocalyptic themes or any of that really during that time. End of the world kind of apocalyptic scenarios are pretty much empty, or at least in terms of trying to connect it to the book of Revelation. You get into the Silver Age, and it starts to show up a little bit, but it's really kind of from around the mid 80s, from around the 1980s on. There's been this tremendous explosion where apocalyptic themes and connections to the Book of Revelation are all over comic books and comic book stories. And again, that's a reflection of the world. You get into the 80s and beyond, and suddenly there's nuclear proliferation. You're worried about bioterrorism, other kinds of terrorism. Climate change starts to become an issue, and suddenly we start to become aware of all these different ways that the world could end, and in particular, ways that we could destroy ourselves. And so
Interesting.
you see that then in the comic book stories with this, more connections to Revelation, more connections to just apocalyptic themes and imagery, again reflecting some of those fears and anxieties that we see in our culture.
I was just going through some of the old comics in my head as you're saying this, and I was like, this isn't something I think I would have thought about myself, but as you say it, I can sort of see the seriousness of these stories gradually getting more and more. You kind of go from, like, even take the first instance of Galactus, for whom this channel is named. He pops up, Reed goes and gets the ultimate nullifier, and then that's that. Galactus is gone, but we still don't, we know Galactus is there, but he's not really like looming over as much. But then you start getting into like the 80s, and I think this is when you start getting guys like Frank Miller and Neil Gaiman, who are like coming over from literature and bringing these. I mean, this is kind of stepping outside the world of Marvel, but if you get into like Neil Gaiman's Sandman, which was just done for Netflix, a tremendous adaptation of that.
Yeah.
You can clearly see where that stuff is coming from, sort of getting into the apocryphal, the fall of Lucifer, Morning Star, and so on and so forth. I don't think I'd really thought about that until you said that, but that certainly does seem to be the case. Do you think that occurred like because of the influx in writers with like either a strong predilection for the theological, or kind of, maybe not, if they don't embrace it, they're awed by it and definitely use it as a background for their writing? Do you think that has something to do with that in the 80s, or is this because now all of those things that were them? For those who don't know, there's a guy who wrote a book called The Seduction of the Innocent that basically got the comics code stacked on things, and that pretty much made it impossible for even this revelationary apocryphal stuff that you're talking about to be printed. Kind of see the comic code go in the way of the dodo after the 80s, after Stan Lee is like, no, I'm publishing my drug story. I don't care about this anymore. Is that where this sudden like flood of apocryphal imagery comes from? Because that's really fascinating you bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, 1986 is kind of a big year in comics history, because that's when you had Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns and you had Watchmen,
Yep.
both coming out that year. Two books that kind of really took a much more cynical sort of look at the whole superhero genre. And that kind of sparked, is thought to have kind of sparked a whole generation of comic writers that wrote darker, more amoral heroes, kind of more of a focus on anti-heroes and so forth. And so I think it does kind of go hand in hand with that, more so than the personal religious beliefs of the authors, especially
Right.
because if you look historically, I mean, you look in the early years of comic books, many of the writers and early comic book creators were Jewish.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
that they had a strong religious kind of
But they
outlook, but
don't.
it didn't really
Yeah.
show up in their stories kind of
Because it's
explicitly.
apocryphal, is it part of their theology that actually, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. So it may have been in the background driving what they did, but it didn't show up overtly. But the last several decades, you're seeing a lot more, scripture being quoted in comic books or being alluded to in a number of much more overt ways.
You even look at like Galactus, like I mentioned it because it's like the easiest character for me. There's even within Galactus, there's a resurrection myth, right? You have Galen of Ta, who recognizes that his entire people are going to be destroyed. So he steps forth and says, let me take this on and my people will be saved. And so he's then reborn as Galactus, and he also gives himself an apostle, we'll call him a herald. He gives himself a herald to sort of go around and foretell of his coming to these different lands. However, albeit when Galactus shows up, he's not bringing good tidings and salvation. He's coming to eat your planet. But you do see these, and I remember I was looking at why Stan Lee wrote that, and he said it was very influenced by religion, but I also can see how Stan Lee's own personal convictions would stop there, because the apocryphal for him, it's not necessarily there. But you get somebody else who writes this character, and they're like, oh, I'm gonna have some fun with him.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the other examples I touched on was Frank Castle. Now I think Castle's sort of an interesting guy because, like Captain America, Frank Castle sort of, maybe even more so now in this era, represents, I'm going to say, a faulty idea of what people think he is. They think he's just retribution. I don't think they understand truly what Castle is about, other they wouldn't be rocking the flag like they do. But you take Frank Castle, who goes from an extremely large scale combat operation in Vietnam. His legend is there. He's not necessarily protecting his soldiers, but he doesn't suffer the fool of high command. He's perfectly fine with fragging a fellow officer if it means keeping his men alive. And then after 9/11, we get this reinvention of Frank Castle, who is an Afghanistan Special Forces veteran who is bent on protecting Judeo-Christian values, even if that's not directly stated. Like, Frank isn't out there, reading from a Bible like the Mennonite or anything. I'm not implying that. But you can see that what went from freedom, Frank fighting for freedom, has now become something nebulously off to the side. How does, when you see something like that, what does your academic sense tell you when you dig into that? What's the mythic reinvention there? Why is that so important for understanding a character like Frank Castle from 1970 to maybe 2023?
For me, it's really, I think the kind of the key there is looking at what's happening in society at the time. What has changed in our world, how have our values shifted, perhaps that's causing these changes in our character. Certainly freedom as a topic has become kind of more polarizing in America today than it certainly was back then.
Sure.
And so, I could see why, with some of the things happening in culture, how there's a shift more towards sort of value, a certain kind of values and things than simply the generic concept of freedom. Yeah, I think, I mean, a large part of, that's what we see, that many of these stories are reacting to what's happening in the culture. For instance, I mentioned, the Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen from 1986, and how they introduced a much more cynical kind of look at superheroes. And so for the next 10 years or so, you had all these very amoral kind of heroes that really kind of dominated, Venom and others that kind of took over. And 1996, this is getting out of Marvel into DC a little bit. I'm much more of a
Uh,
Marvel fan, but I try to be bipartisan when I can. And
Absolutely.
I did actually. There's also there's a DC or there's a Theology in the DC universe book that's coming out soon that
Oh,
I wrote one of
cool.
the chapters for,
I'll have to check
and I
that
wrote
out.
about the 1996 series Kingdom Come.
Oh yeah, I just
Large,
finished reading that.
yeah, largely. I mean, there's a whole lot of revelation. That's one of those examples with just a ton of revelation stuff, which is part of what interested me. But it comes 10 years after the Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen, and this introduction of these really amoral superheroes. And if you look at what's happening in the story of Kingdom Come, it's kind of reflecting what's been happening in the comics industry as well as what's been happening in the world. That this, how the traditional kind of value-based superheroes have been replaced with all these amoral heroes, and you see that's what's going on in the world of Kingdom Come. The traditional, Batman, Wonder Woman, Superman have either disappeared or they've gone into exile, they've retired, and now the whole new generation of superheroes are these all kind of anti-hero, amoral heroes. And so Kingdom Come is kind of commenting on that reinvention of its own mythology, how it's been changed, and kind of sort of addressing how can we retain future in a society that's moving in a much more cynical, amoral kind of way. And so it's kind of interestingly in that it's commenting kind of on its own mythic reinvention that's been happening within the industry.
And it certainly has been happening quite a lot too. I found that the number of characters who are almost getting Now, the MCU I kind of set aside because I like to think of the MCU as almost like the ultimate universe. Like, I don't think Marvel ever said they were going one for one from the comics. So I see the MCU just as the ultimate, just as 1605 or anything. But certainly, if we look at the origin stories of some of these characters, they've changed over the years. And they've gone from maybe things that were popular then, and they still use the maybe the mechanism to do it, but they definitely couch the situation within the larger context of what's going on, I think, especially for some of the more important characters that they're maybe trying to recast in a new mythology. I think a good for this one was like Kukulkan was sort of reinvented from Namor. He comes from these Lemurian backgrounds, and now all of a sudden he's able to he's Mesoamerican, and we're doing that so that way we don't continuously heap white people into these things. But why is
Mhm.
this so important that we do this, and why does this make it so related to other forms of mythic reinvention that have done this? Like, I'm trying to establish this pattern here.
Well, I mean, your mention of the origins is kind of interesting because that is a fascinating thing to do. To take, you can pretty much, you take a lot of the major Marvel characters and they've had multiple origins. I mean, I can't, I've lost track of how many times Spider-Man origin story has been retold, and every time it's retold, there's something different about it. And so, just kind of tracing that, how the story gets changed each time it's being retold, I think, is just kind of a fascinating thing to look at. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's just I mean, it's an interesting idea. One of the chapters in the book actually is on mythic reinvention. Kobolowski, he used the Thor movies as kind of his basis for exploring that. His kind of idea is, he's talking about how mythology or myths are often viewed as inherited traditions. We tend to think of them as these stories that were kind of in a fixed form that just get passed on from generation to generation. And he wants to explore how actually, if you look at that process, there's a lot more individual creativity involved. That as these stories get passed on, they get retold, and
Yeah.
the people retelling the story change the story in different ways, and shape the story in different ways. Again, to fit the needs of the time and the culture and so forth. And so, when you look at the Thor movies, the Thor trilogy in the MCU. I mean, it's drawing on all different kinds of traditions. So you've got the Norse myths and all the traditions of that. You've got the comics history of all the Thor stories that have been told, and then you've got everything that had been going on in the MCU up to that point. And so, when they're making these movies, they're drawing from all these different traditions, inherited traditions that are being passed on. But of course, the person writing that movie, whether it's Taika Waititi or whoever, whichever Thor movie you're looking at, they're putting their own spin on that, their own individual creativity. And so, this is just something it's just a part of what we do as human beings. We have these stories that are foundational, that are important because they shape our values, our self-understanding, our identity. But again, those things are malleable; they change over time, and so we retell these stories, to make them fit better with, our current time and our current focus.
And that's what I think makes this stuff so unique. I kind of want to get into one of the columns in your book before we get you out of here. And we talk the very first article in your book, which I recommend if you're a comic fan or you get into this stuff, you just love the mythology and theology of these characters. I can't recommend this book enough. There's some really interesting and compelling arguments within all the other stories. But the one that I read for the purposes of our discussion today was, this sort of Thanos self-sacrifice and sort of this discussion of Paul and Kenosis. Laying down the brief foundation for what Kristen's talking about when she says Paul and Kenosis and how it relates to Thanos. Do you want to sort of simplify that real quick for our reader? And I'll just jump into a few questions on that.
Well, what the idea is there, she's referring to the letter of Paul to the church at Philippi, the book of Philippians. And it's largely chapter 2 in Philippians. There's a section in there that's called the Christ hymn, where Paul essentially basically recites a hymn, an ancient early Christian hymn referring to Jesus Christ. And the term kenosis, it's a Greek word that's used in that hymn that refers to an emptying. And the idea in that story is it's talking about the sacrifice of Christ. It talks about how Christ was equal with God, but that in the incarnation, when he became human, he had to empty himself. He had to give up, in order to become human, he had to give up his equality with God. So he emptied himself in a sense of that equality in order to become human and die, and that was part of his sacrifice. And so she's taking that idea and kind of looking at the notion of sacrifice in the Infinity War movies, particularly Infinity War and Endgame, and relating that in particular to, you've got Thanos, who talks a lot about sacrifice, and he sees himself
Yeah.
as being sacrificial. But if you really look at it, it's not the kind of sacrifice we see in Paul or in Scripture. The type of, Thanos' sacrifice is one that, he keeps talking about how much it cost him, but it doesn't really cost him. It costs other people. I mean,
Yeah.
it's half of all of the universe that's going to suffer, that's having to sacrifice. And
It's
even,
like
he
he
talks
feels
about
like
having.
he's aggrieved for having to do this. That's the sacrifice that he sees upon himself. It's like, oh,
Right.
I'm Christ. I have to carry this out.
And even, yeah, with the death of Gamora,
Yeah.
because he says he loved her, it's his sacrifice, but she's the one that's actually paying the price. And so, that she kind of contrasts that notion of sacrifice, which is a fairly common one in our culture, where we'll talk about sacrifice, but it's, other people that often have to bear the burdens of those sacrifices. And she kind of contrasts that, particularly with, the actions of Tony Stark at the end of the movie, who really embodies the kind of sacrifice, that kind of kenosis that we see in Paul, where, he is actually sacrificing himself to save other people. So it's not, sacrificing others or doing things that have implications for others, but he's
And
emptying
what's
himself in a sense in order to save others.
and she contrasts this, of course, with the background of Captain America. She takes these two people who go on diametrically opposed paths that actually kind of meet up and sort of converge, and one sort of goes on the other path and the other goes on the other's path. And I find it so interesting because each of these characters learn a bit about, she says this pretty eloquent, she says that Steve learned he didn't need to be the person always making the sacrifice, that sometimes it was okay to take the win. Tony needed to learn that you can't always cut the wire. Sometimes you have to make the fatal play. And I thought that her way of contrasting that with Thanos, who, as you state, he drags Gamora, he throws her off, he talks a lot about this and that, but when it comes to the actual deeds that a savior would make, they're just completely missing with Thanos. So, given that, why do you think, and she alludes to this in the column, why were so many people, including myself, saying he was right? Where does that come from? What part of ourselves says that, like, yeah, this guy's got a point, and then it still becomes the but, right? We're the people that say but so we don't act it out. Like, why? Where does that come from? Like, is that the Paul in us saying, well, yeah, but is I guess
Well, I
that's
think part of it is, I think we like the general idea of, yeah, we got too many people, too much strain on the resources. And so, somebody might say, yeah, Thanos is right. We need to get rid of half of the people. But, the people who say that assume that they'll be one of the people that survives. They're not
right.
willing to make the sacrifice, to be the people that are the people that are gotten rid of, essentially. Um, but yeah, I mean, again, I think it ties into just a more common understanding of sacrifice that we have in our culture, um, that in some sense kind of goes against the kind of sacrifice that Paul talks about, which is a truly sacrificial, emptying yourself, giving up something for others rather than expecting other people to give up. Kind of one of the things we see with sacrifice is often calling upon people to give up something for the greater good.
Right.
But again, that's usually calling upon other people to give things up for the greater good, rather than a willingness to give up something or sacrifice something oneself.
And I think I'm trying to pull up one of the things that I had noted here. So I really liked this quote that she sort of put at the end, and I think that this for me was I was like, I wrote down, I was like, damn, this is kind of a really powerful moment for me. She says, the true hero then is someone who is willing to fight for their ideals, and it is more than someone who considers the greater good or the need of others. The hero is somebody who is willing to learn, grieve, grow, grapple, and ultimately yield and ultimately be shaped by the process. And she had passed this up previously by talking about Thanos. He had mentioned he exhibits no change. He's confronted with failure. He doubles down and he blames others in gratitude for like not understanding why this faulty plan of his works. And I think that when you get into the idea of sacrifice and martyr, even martyrdom, right, sort of kind of comes into this because you're talking about dying for a greater cause. Is there is Thanos's notion of martyrdom sort of like almost drawn from this? And I'm not saying that we don't have, Christians being persecuted across time. Like I'm trying to think of like this example, and I think it was I want to say it was I can't remember who wrote it down, but they were talking about when the Romans were like, hey, if you don't want to disown your God, like we're gonna, this is gonna happen. And the Christian guy is like, I'm not gonna do it. I'm not gonna do it. And then he's like, all right, Tacitus, go and get the tools. And the minute they see these tools as what's going to happen, they're like, you know what? On second thought, I don't want to do this. And it was a Roman writer basically writing to, the Christians saying, like, if you're thinking of intentional martyrdom, like, don't. This isn't a fun cause. You're not going to be doing anything worthy. If you actually want to make a genuine self-sacrifice, there are so much better ways to go about doing this rather than simply dying for the sake of dying. If you know who I'm talking about, I had just watched an interview where they were discussing that letter and the Christian got it involved, and now it's escaping me. But I hope that made sense a little.
Yeah, I'm not sure who you're referring to. It could be there is the Pliny Trajan correspondence. I don't know if that's what you're thinking
I
of.
think it might be that. I think it might be
Yeah,
Clinton because it was definitely when it was like some of the Christians were like, "I'll volunteer," and then like they said, go get this stuff, and he's like, "No, no, no, I'm out, I'm out, I'm good."
yeah,
This
yeah. It's
wasn't
basically
to dispute the martyrdom of Christians, but there was that one incident where the martyr was like, "I'm in." Wait, no, I'm not. I'm out.
yeah, it's where the the governor Pliny, who was a governor of an area in Asia Minor, he was writing to the Roman Emperor Trajan asking for
Yes.
advice about what to do with Christians because he wasn't quite sure. And
Yes.
so he describes what he's done to this point, which is he brings them forward and he asks them if they're Christians. Um,
Yes.
and if they say they're not and they're willing to curse Christ, then he lets them go. But if they insist, he gives them several. He actually gives them several chances
Yeah.
to
Is he
renounce
like saying
Christ.
like, "Come on, guys,
Yeah,
like just throw a little ash on the fire," or just like
yeah.
say okay on a Tuesday. Like he's really trying to give these people any chance whatsoever, and they're like, "Nope, I'm a Christian."
And part of it's because Pliny doesn't really even understand why they're being what they're being accused of.
Right.
Because at the point that he's writing, Christianity outlawed. It was not illegal to be a Christian in the Roman Empire at that point in time. That's something that came later. And so he isn't really sure why these people are being brought on trial or what he's supposed to do with them. And so even when he says he when they refuse to curse Christ and he orders them to be executed, he says he's doing it just because they're stubborn and not giving in to what he tells them to do,
Yeah.
rather than because of any specific crimes that they've committed.
And it sort of seems like this is what we run into with Thanos. He gives this very nebulous reason for everything he did. It sounds good in context, of course, supplies and whatnot. But then you get into this argument that she also presents in her article, like, why does someone always have to die, right? Like, where this sort of comes down to like this, these three possibilities. And why does there have to be a three? Like, why can Thanos not use the glove and make more resources? Why can he just not make infinite resources? Like, how
Yeah.
does when she brings all of this up and ties it all into one ball, what is she trying to say about these acts or the lack thereof of these acts in relation to Thanos? How is she setting this up?
Well, I think it's more really just trying to talk about again sort of the nature of what real
Sure.
sacrifice is. And again, using Jesus as that sort of model of what a real sacrifice is, where it costs the person something. It's about emptying oneself, and how we see that represented in the different characters. And it will kind of, I guess, kind of a broader question I'll kind of tie this into, because I think this article does a good job of kind of illustrating the broader question of theology and Marvel, um, which is, even though she's, engaging with Philippians chapter 2 and the writings of Paul, when we talk about kind of the interaction between theology and Marvel, it's not that, we assume that the writers of these films or the writers of these comic books, we don't know if the writer of Avengers Endgame ever has read the book of Philippians.
Yeah.
They may not even know what's going on in Philippians 2. And so it's not that we assume that these writers are deliberately, engaging these theological ideas and so forth. It's more about sort of bringing the two into dialogue. So you have this story that's being told, but then you also have what's going on in theology, and it's about creating a dialogue between them and allowing that dialogue and conversation to get us to see things maybe in the story that we didn't notice before. Get us to look at it in a different way, see areas of overlap between the two. Because theological stories and superhero stories are often doing the same thing. They deal in the same kind of themes. Redemption, hope, sacrifice, standing up against evil, and so forth. And so there's a lot of fertile ground there for creating a dialogue between the two. And this article does a good job of, talking about that, or showing that in a way where, it's not that the author needs to be aware of Philippians 2, but looking at Philippians 2 and the notion of sacrifice there can help us to think through the issue of sacrifice in this film, and maybe learn something about it from some different perspectives.
Yeah, I think that's important here. Like, some people might be like, why are you applying this to that? Or maybe they didn't mean that. Yeah, that's not what's going on here. These are ways to interpret it through a foundation of knowledge which already exists, that has expounded heavily upon these topics over the years, and from which, even if not directly, we can be reasonably certain that most of these comic writers, whom I know personally, I talk to a lot of them myself, having covered working in the entertainment industry as well. I know that there is a ton of theology, philosophy, and thought that goes into what they write. So I'm going to try and get you out of here with some really simple questions. What is the scholarship on this as of right now? How has it changed, and what do you think books and conversations like this are doing for the ground of scholarship that you just mentioned? This subject is fertile for these things. So where is the scholarship at now? Where is it going, and what can we do to help it get there?
Well, on sort of theology, really just the scholar, treating comic books and superhero stories is a fairly new thing. As I mentioned, again, for a lot of its history, they weren't seen as being worthy of any kind of academic attention. So it's really something that's really only come about the last several decades. And one of the early sort of attempts at this from 1994 is a book by Richard Reynolds called Superheroes: A Modern Mythology. And so he wrote this book all about seeing these as mythological stories and exploring them from an academic perspective. And that kind of set off a lot of that. So since then, there's been a lot of books sort of written on comic books and mythology, not just comparing it to Greek mythology, Christian literature, but even near Middle Eastern theology and Norse mythology and so forth. So there's been a lot of study that's been done on that. And it's not so much about it's not that the scholarship has necessarily changed, except because it's only been the last 30-40 years.
Sure.
This has really been explored.
Academics hasn't had enough time to change yet.
Yeah. And so it's really, academics changed pretty slowly. And so it's really been more about kind of expanding and focusing. And so you had him, Reynolds, kind of talking about the intersection with mythology. Not too longer after that, 2006, BJ Oropeza did a book on the gospel according to Marvel, or the gospel according to superheroes, not just Marvel. And that was one of the early ones that really explored theology in Marvel in kind of a book form. A lot of good articles and chapters in that one as well. But then it's just, it just kind of has focused. I mentioned one of the books that I contributed to was edited by Dan Clanton, called The End Will Be Graphic. And it was all about looking at, again, apocalyptic themes in the book of Revelation in comic books. And so, that's where kind of it's been going, where you have this broad look. We can talk about theology or philosophy or, mythology generally, but now you see scholars kind of zeroing in, doing more narrow kinds of studies. In fact, one book, I think it's coming out this year, probably coming out this year. I forget the exact title, but it's a book on looking at superhero stories and depth psychology.
Oh,
And so,
wow.
yes, and these are kind of the main areas. It's usually theology, philosophy, and psychology are kind of the main academic
I've seen a
areas
little
that
bit of
really,
sociology here
yeah.
and now then too, but that's sort of a newer thing, I think. Like I definitely think you're more right about the theology and philosophy and stuff. And being a former sociologist too, I don't even necessarily know if sociology is going to give us too much in that field. I mean, I know it can, but maybe that's just me being critical of my own field.
Oh yeah, I think there's some grounds, some possibilities for exploration there from the sociological
Possibly.
perspective for sure.
What in this particular book that we're talking about that people go out and get, you can find it on Amazon. It's about it's no more than $35, and it is a tremendous insight to Marvel and theology. Before we get you out of here, I want to know, I got two questions for you. The first one is going to be, what was your favorite contribution to the book, and what it meant to you and why? And keep in mind, I told you, but for the audience, I'm not asking him to play favorites. I'm asking him to sort of pick the one that came in and it was like, maybe you spent a little bit more time editing that one because it sat with your soul, or maybe something was going on that day that article spoke to you in a different way or something. Was there one that came in that you would tell fans, like, what, hey, out of all of them are great, but I truly, truly, truly felt this one on a personal level?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of difficult because there are, I could cite different
Tremendous.
ones for different reasons.
Yeah.
We just talked a lot about Kristen Mitchell's one. I mean, that was one that I liked a lot. All of them I liked for different reasons. So just to pick one as kind of an illustration, one of them that I liked is the one by Taylor Ott, where she wrote about the ethics of self-sacrifice and self-preservation in Jessica Jones, in
Mm-hmm.
the Netflix series rather than the the comic book series. And one of the things I liked about that one is she kind of challenges the obligations of heroism. Kind of raises this question, because Jessica Jones has power, does that mean she's obligated to be a hero?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's an interesting question. I mean, we know how Peter Parker would answer it. Great
Yeah.
power comes great responsibility. So he would say,
Responsibility.
yes,
Yeah.
you are obligated. But she talks about how Jessica Jones suggests a different approach to that. And she engages that question by kind of looking at the story of Jessica Jones and this hero in the context of how women have often been sort of asked to sacrifice, and historically, and how the
Yeah.
language of sacrifice and the notion of sacrifice as it's been applied to women has often been kind of used in an oppressive way. And she then relates that to kind of personal trauma and overcoming personal trauma, as Jessica Jones is seeking to do. And so just kind of an interesting look at this topic about, she uses her power to overcome her trauma. She uses it in some different ways, but does that mean, she has to be a hero? Does she have to fit into this certain box that we have sort of created for what a hero needs to be? And I just, that one kind of sat with me just because it was sort of a very unique and insightful look at the topic.
Yeah.
And it does
Very
what I think
personal.
these good essays do, where they get us to think about something that we're familiar with, but get us to look at it from a different perspective and maybe think about some questions that we hadn't thought about before.
Where do you come down on that, curiously? Do you think that if a person had powers, like if a person existed today, do you think it would be incumbent upon them, or do you think that, much like anything else, it comes down to, because just because a person has tremendous superpowers, like they can be completely debilitated mentally, just overracked
Mhm.
with guilt and self-doubt or something like that. So on a personal level, what do you think the answer would be? There's no right or wrong answer here. I
Yeah.
don't think I know how to answer that one way or the next, if I'm being honest. I could see
Yeah. I
arguments
mean, I think,
both
well,
ways.
not just my mug here, but given the fact that I've always
Yeah,
been a
yeah,
Spider-Man fan.
yeah. I was. My final question was going to be, why don't you tell me why Spider-Man's your favorite hero, and why you chose to write about him in the Theology of Weakness? But since I love Spider-Man too, you can just sort of tell me, like, what was it that brought you in, and what keeps you going with Spider-Man, and we'll round out on that. It's a very good character to end on.
Yeah, I mean, I've been a Spider-Man fan as long as I can remember, and I don't know if it's because he was the first I really superhero I encountered. Because I remember when I was a kid growing up in Chicago as a little kid in the late '60s when I was a child. That's when the Electric Company TV show was on,
Oh yeah.
and they had Spider-Man come on as a character, because he was a fairly new superhero at the time. And that was kind of my first introduction to him, and he just kind of fascinated me on there. And so then I started reading some Spider-Man comics and just really got into it. So I don't know why. I mean, I think I gravitate towards Spider-Man for a lot of the same reasons most people do, which is that he's just a normal person with normal problems. And yet he's got this power and he's trying to figure out what to do with it. And so, as many people have noted, he's probably the most relatable superhero that people can connect with. And I just found, so many superheroes have kind of the same power set. They're either really strong or they can fly and things like that. And his power of sticking to walls and shooting webs was just so unique and different. And just by itself doesn't seem like it'd be all that great. I mean, what's so great about being able to stick to a wall? And so just that kind of underdog superhero in some way, and that kind of attracted me to his
And then
character, I think.
And then once people like Todd McFarlane got a hold of the character and changed that art to those like no these spaghetti webs that we know and love today, like these images just become indelible and iconic in your brain. To answer the question on my end, it always been Frank Castle for me, not because I had this redemptive, like I've never fired a gun in my entire life, not even a BB gun, but like I understood Frank Castle on an emotional, visceral level, having grew up in the residential treatment centers and group homes and sort of facilities. Like I understood this nature of injustice so very early on. And I always gravitated towards the idea of, I think, somebody who could solve the problems, but also understood well and truly enough that sometimes I think what I understand the most about Castle, even though mentally and physically I could never do it, I understand that sometimes the problem has to be solved. And when I say solved, I mean solved. But that completely like goes against what I believe on a personal level, which is that I believe, anyone can be saved, anyone can you can talk to a lot of people, if you can figure out a way to get to them. But the problem is how do you figure out that way? So yeah, I mean that's sort of where I ran into with Frank Castle. But I want to like thank you so much for your time. And if there's anything you want to add to people out there, something that I didn't get to, or a seminar or a class or something you have coming up that you want to point people to, please take the time to do so now. And definitely once this other stuff comes out and I've got the book in, I can already see at least 2 or 3 articles on here that I'd love to call you back on sometime and talk about. And I've reached out to some of the individual authors to talk to them as well, because there's some really, really interesting stuff in here that I can't wait to explore on a deeper level. So the floor is yours, Dr. Stevenson. Take it away.
Yeah, I mean, not really too much to add there. I mean, I would just say, yeah, I think, if you're able to reach out to some of the individual authors, that would be great, because some of them, I mean, they wrote some fascinating things that
Yeah.
are very provocative. And there are several of them that would be really fun just to dig into
I
much,
reached
much
out to
deeper.
Kristen on Twitter if you know of any way to like, I mean, because ever since the algorithm got changed, ever since my actual verification got taken away, I think I get like 1 or 2 like notices on my. I'm not even sure what happens. Like I don't care, but like if you could like, hey, this guy's trying to read. I've tried. Like I just don't think the Twitter algorithm likes me anymore. but yeah,
Yeah,
no,
but
I'm.
if you're trying to reach some of them and you're not able to get through, I can probably try to help you.
Oh, I
See
appreciate
if
that.
if my contact information for them is still good.
See if you know a few people, one or 2 things. But yeah, do you have anything? You said that DC book is coming out. Do you have a about time frame on that? And if people want to pre-order that, is there somewhere they can go? Do they just need to be aware of it? Where can they get that book when that comes out, or whatever
That
information you can give?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it seems like I got an email not too long ago saying it was kind of in the stage where it's getting ready to go to the printer and
Sure.
kind of in the final stages. Usually when that happens, it's usually not more than a couple of months. So yeah, I don't have an exact time frame. I'm not sure if
Okay.
it's available for pre-order yet or not, but it should be coming out in the next couple months. Yeah.
And then you said the site was what again, where you started posting all these contents that we can go and read? You mentioned that has like all these content on theology and things of that nature. The pop culture site was.
Yeah, it's by Matthew Brake, who's also an academic very interested in this. And the name of the site is Pop Culture and Theology.
Okay.
And so it has a lot of just essays on there, kind of blog type essays that different people and academics have written. And again, he's the person who sort of edits the series that Theology in the Marvel Universe and these books are in.
Perfect.
And you can go on there and even if if there's somebody out there that's interested in sort of writing for one of these books, he has calls for papers up there for
I'll
different
submit.
volumes that are coming out. Yeah, so you can kind of submit a proposal if you're interested in writing. So
I'm absolutely interested.
yeah,
I've had some
that's a
ideas
site
on
worth
the back
checking out.
burner. Do you know what citation format they use preferred? Is it do they care? Do they take a lot of different citation sites, or will I have to go back and relearn how to cite everything?
Yeah, well, usually, I mean, if it's for a book, yeah, they'll the publisher usually will send you a list of the citation because the publisher has a very specific citation format for people to use.
So, all right, perfect. Dr. Stevenson, I want to say thank you so much, man. This interview was exactly what I wanted it to be. I feel nourished this morning. I hope that you had some fun with this. And I just want to say thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoy your passion for the subject. You can tell you're knowledgeable about it, and you can just tell that you've probably thought about this an incredible amount. So just thank you for taking a little time to join us today here on Gospel of Galactus. And I definitely hope to have you back on because this is what I like doing.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. I've enjoyed this quite a bit myself as well.
Well, I will wish you a good day. Thank your wife and your dogs for being so patient for me, and we will catch you next time, Dr. Stevenson. Thank you so very much. I will have links in the description for everyone for the sites that he said, so don't worry about that. And I will have this up on YouTube by the end of the day, and I will email it to you so you can share it on anything you want.
All right, sounds good.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. We'll catch you next time.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.